in the Center for Health and Social Care Research, Sheffield, Hallam University. He has a degree in philosophy from the University of Cambridge, but pursued a career as a jobbing researcher until the 1990s, when he reverted to being a philosopher. Since then, he has written on a number of philosophical topics in healthcare and health-related research. His recent publications include work on cognition and compassion, hope, lived experience, Heidegger, complexity theory, the philosophy of qualitative research methods, spirituality in healthcare, narrative and nursing ethics. John, the floor is yours.
Okay, John, I will now give you the control of the system. Just give me a minute here. And now you will be able to show your screen. And I will mute my microphone. And I will open yours. So now we go, and you just say OK. You click OK where it asks show my screen. You say OK, and then everyone.
I've done that. Yep, I've done that. Okay, you've suddenly gone quiet. Okay, I'm live then, am I?
Yes, you are. Okay. You're live, and everything is fine.
Thanks. Okay, smashing. Okay, well, thank you for the introduction, and thanks to IIQM and ATLAS.ti for inviting me to speak this evening. It's much appreciated. Thank you also to the people who've signed on and registered and sitting waiting for me to go. I hope to have some discussion with you later in the session. Okay, as you can see, I'm going to talk about certain aspects of research and meaning, kind of complicated subject, so we'll only be kind of taking little samples of it this evening, a kind of skimming a stone across a river, a few bounces along the way. This picture, by the way, is a picture of a sort of famous ancestor of mine, William Paley, who was a theologian and philosopher, first division theologian, but only a third division philosopher. And he's here because he's got absolutely nothing to do with what I'm going to be talking about. Meaning pops up in qualitative methods a lot in a number of different contexts. I'm going to mention two here, but there are others. These are two of the more important ones. First of all, we have contexts in which meaning is incorporated into a statement of research aim to explore, elucidate, illuminate, or whatever the verb of choice is, the meaning of a phenomenon or experience. So that's one context in which meaning comes up. Largely, it has to be said in phenomenological research of one type or another. And then it pops up in accounts of research method, where there is talk of identifying themes by analysing interview transcripts for meanings, common meanings, and so on. This will all be familiar to all of you who've listening this evening. Here are some brief examples. Again, they'll be familiar kinds of things. So as an aim to uncover an understanding of the meaning of quality of practice for practicing nurses, or to elucidate the meaning of pedagogical practice, and then as a method, variations on what you've just seen, the idea that one looks for common meanings, and that's got something to do with the development of themes. Given that meaning has this central importance in qualitative methods, one might expect that there was some kind of extended discussion about it, and a theory, if you like, of meaning, what it is, how to elucidate or illuminate it, what you do when you've got one, and so on. Strangely enough, there actually isn't very much in the way of discussions of that kind. They're few and far between. They're not very detailed, and more often than not, the subject is actually ducked. As for the metaphors, well, let's have a look at some answers to the first kind of question, what kind of thing is a meaning or meaning? Let's have a look at what some of the kind of classic methodologists say about that. Weber talks about the inside of outside behavior. I mean, that's obviously highly metaphorical. It doesn't necessarily help us to understand what meaning is. Schutz, certain way of directing one's gaze at an item of one's own experience. Well, again, metaphorical, unless you have this sense that we have a kind of an internal sort of searchlight that looks around and focuses on this particular item of one experience in a certain kind of way. Again, it's not obvious that this is particularly helpful. Reality is a construction in the minds of individuals with meanings being attached to the phenomenon, Lincoln and Guber. Well, that's a bit more intelligible, but again, it doesn't actually tell us much about meaning. It tells us about reality being a construction in the mind, although it also talks about a phenomenon, which sounds as if it's kind of external to the mind, and the mind attaches meaning to the phenomenon, so that's not particularly clear. But it doesn't tell us what the meaning is, or it doesn't tell us how to attach it. And then Van Maanen, we must engage language in a primal incantation of poetizing, which harkens back to the silence from which words emanate. And I'm not going to say anything about that one because I have absolutely no idea what it means. Okay, so if there's not a lot of explicit discussion about the nature of meaning, maybe a better strategy is to actually look at some examples from methodological writing, where people like Max van Maanen or Amadeo Giorgi actually explain what we're doing with meaning, how to identify a meaning, how to transform a meaning or perform a thematic formulation in Van Maanen's terms. If we look at some examples of how they do that, maybe that will actually be more revealing. And I was originally, as you will have gathered from the slide, I was going to actually give two examples, one from each, but I think I've tried to have a run through with this, and actually there's only time for one. So I'm going to stick to Amadeo Giorgi. And I'm going to talk about an example of his in the last chapter of his book, The Descriptive Phenomenological Method in Psychology, a Modified Husserlian Approach. And the last chapter is a worked through example of an analysis of meaning in the context of the structure of jealousy. It's a long chapter, it's 70 pages long, it's very detailed, and it certainly repays close study in a way that I'll try and indicate as we go. So Giorgi starts this chapter with two stories of jealousy, both written by, I think they were workshop participants, and they are both autobiographical accounts of situations in which jealousy was to the fore. And basically Giorgi analyzes these stories according to his own method, and you can see the 4 steps of Giorgi's method there. And we could spend a considerable amount of time looking at each one of them, even the first. Could spend all evening actually looking at the 4 of them, but I'm going to cut through to the third one, transform the meaning units, and look at what he calls meaning transformations. The first stage, or rather the second stage, is basically dividing the text into sections called meaning units, and that's simply a matter, well, I say simply, it's not actually simple at all. It's a matter of marking the points at which there is what he calls a shift in meaning and putting a marker there, and then between 2 markers you have a meaning unit. And then the third stage, he takes each meaning unit and transforms them. And here's what he says, or some of what he says about meaning transformations, and it's worth just making a mental note of this to check with what actually happens in a minute. Meaning units are expressed in language, revelatory of the psychological aspect of the lived-through experience, and this requires a heightened articulation of the psychological aspect of each meaning unit. Okay, so what's going on here is he takes the meaning unit, which is a section of the original story told by the participant, and he transforms it in a way which brings out or makes revelatory the psychological aspect of the lived through experience, this heightened articulation of that. And the transformation's main purpose is to describe carefully the intuitive psychological senses that present themselves to the consciousness of the researcher. Okay, so the transformation is designed to somehow bring out the psychological aspect, a heightened articulation of that, something that's revelatory of that, of the meaning unit. You would expect at this point to have some kind of explanation of how this is done, how this transformation is carried out. But as I've kind of indicated earlier, this is the kind of discussion we don't usually get, and in fact this is all Giorgi has to say about the matter. It would have kind of, the chapter's long enough already, it would have made things even longer, and it's the kind of thing that belongs in a workbook, despite the fact that the chapter is actually supposed to be a worked through example. However, it's important to know that the analysis requires discipline and many attempts at getting the right expression. So something revelatory of the psychological aspect of the lived through experience, and it requires discipline and a lot of trial and error, or at least many attempts. Okay, so let's now have a look at this actually happening. Here's one of the examples of a meaning unit. Let me just explain what's on the screen. The left-hand column is the meaning unit itself. It's a section of the text of the original author who told the story of jealousy. It's the 7th meaning unit, as you can see, but that's not particularly relevant for our purposes. The middle column is the first attempt at a transformation, the bringing out of the psychological aspect, the revelatory bit. And the third column is usually a further transformation, which follows the second. In this particular case, Giorgi obviously thinks that he got the transformation right first time, and the third column is blank. I mean, I've chosen this one precisely because the third column is blank, so we only have to look at the relationship between the left-hand column, the original text, and Giorgi's transformation of it. So you will have had a quick look at that, presumably while I've been talking, and you will be making a note of the differences and what actually counts as a transformation. In order to help with that process, I've highlighted in colour the relevant bits, so that the red bit in the left-hand column corresponds to the red bit in the middle column. So he didn't know any of the people because he was unfamiliar with. Any of the people just becomes the people, so the any of goes. In the lunch group that he went out with becomes with whom he went to lunch. Friends that were together with them becomes friends that were present at the lunch. And then was flirting with is transformed into was demonstrating a romantic interest in. Okay, so what exactly have we got here? He didn't know becomes was unfamiliar with, and in the lunch group that he went out with becomes with whom he went to lunch, and so on. I'll come back to this slide in a minute, but let's just quickly summarize what we appear to have here. What we've got is rough synonyms. For example, he didn't know and he was unfamiliar with. Minor syntactic modifications. For example, in the lunch group that he went out with, compare with whom he went out to lunch. That's presumably for anybody who doesn't think you should end an English sentence with a participle. And then, I mean, all the other examples are examples of one or the other of those. And then the final one is actually slightly different. Was flirting with becomes was demonstrating a romantic interest in. Now, I don't know about you, but to my ear, there's actually a fairly significant difference between was flirting with and was demonstrating a romantic interest in. Flirting sounds a bit like a bit of a game. I mean, it may lead to something more serious, to the demonstration of a romantic interest, but it doesn't have to. Very often it doesn't, and very often both people engaged in flirting know that it won't. So demonstrating a romantic interest to me sounds a bit heavier, a bit weightier, a bit more serious. But for some reason, Giorgi has transformed was flirting with into was demonstrating a romantic interest in. The point about all these transformations, given that he's already ducked the question as to how this is done, is never justified. None of these transformations is justified. We don't get any sense of why he didn't know becomes was unfamiliar with, or in particular, why was unfamiliar with is more psychologically revelatory, why it's a heightened articulation of the psychological aspect of this particular expression. In the same way, why is with whom he went to lunch more psychologically revelatory than in the lunch group that he went out with? It just doesn't seem plausible to suggest that these minor amendments of synonymy and syntax can have any kind of psychological import at all. Now, you might think, and it would not be an unreasonable suspicion, that I'm cherry picking. I've picked out a particularly unconvincing example of something that is not representative of the rest. But, in fact, it's all like this. Have a look at that chapter, work through the various examples of transformations, and you will see it's all this superficial, it's all this trivial. Apart from the very occasional thing where we get something like flirting becoming demonstrating a romantic interest in, it's all minor synonym changes and minor syntactic variation. There's nothing which, to me at least, looks remotely psychologically revelatory or a heightened articulation of the psychological aspect of the lived through experience. They're random, arbitrary changes to the wording, and that's it. And as I say, if you check the chapter, have a look through it, you'll find that it's all like that. It's not just that this is one kind of like, particularly unconvincing example. It's entirely representative. Here are a few more examples from other meaning units. This time there's a right-hand column, although, as you can see, in most cases, apart from one, either the phrase is omitted altogether or the column is left blank. So each happily married to their spouses becomes both in happy marriages to their spouses. Had a cold, was a bit under the weather and fatigued. secretly hoping becomes covertly wishing, and then becomes secretly entertaining the wish, which is presumably even more psychologically revelatory of the meaning of the experience than covertly wishing. And none of this is explained. None of it is, there's no explanation of how you get from A to B and then to C, and how the meaning transformation is accomplished. All we have is this assurance about its significance, the psychological revelation, and then this series of arbitrary, superficial, trivial changes. And it's all like that. I wish I had time to go through more examples. I wish I had time to have a look at the Van Maanen example I was going to share with you as well, and indeed other methodologies as well. The general point I would want to make is that on my reading, the methodologists who deal in meaning and the elucidation of meaning all have examples which are comparable, at least, with the one you've just seen. There's never any sense of how you get from A to B and then to C, how the meaning transformation takes place, how the thematic formulation is accomplished. And at the end of the day, what you end up with looks as if it's fairly arbitrary. It's certainly unjustified. In Giorgi's case, it's highly arbitrary. I mean, they just seem to be random changes. And in somebody like Van Maanen's case, it's a bit more than that, because there's usually with Van Maanen an agenda of some kind to do with parenthood or pedagogy. But in all the cases that we could look at, I would be saying something broadly similar, that this is not any kind of a method, and it actually, for the most part, looks fairly arbitrary all the way through. Okay. So in terms of looking at examples of worked through analyses of meaning, we haven't really yet got anything that's particularly convincing. So I'm going to take a different approach to this, come at meaning from a slightly different angle, namely corpus linguistics. Some of you may be familiar with this, some of you won't. Corpus, a corpus, plural corpora, are enormous databases of text. They incorporate chunks of text, a sentence or a paragraph, with all the words in it tagged for parts of speech. As you can see, they're very large. The British National Corpus, which isn't added to anymore, is 100 million words. COCA, Corpus of Contemporary American English, 450 million words. And the latest one to come online, Google Books American English, 155 billion words. These are all held at Brigham Young University, managed by Mark Davis. You can see the link there. It's free. You can just go online, sign in, register, and then you can just use these databases as you like. The point of these databases is that you can identify particular target words and phrases, interrogate the database with that, let's say, a word, and what the database will then produce is a comprehensive list of every context in which that word appears in the database. So it appears in the middle of a line with the words in the same vicinity on either side of it, the words that immediately precede it, the words that immediately come after it. And on that basis, you can undertake various analyses of something called collocation, which is basically the same idea, the words which appear in the same vicinity as the target word that you've identified. So in this particular case, I'm going to be interested in words, cognates of mean and means and meaning, where these occur in a non-lexicographical context. In other words, where we're not talking about word meaning, but the meaning of an experience or a phenomenon or concept, and where the means doesn't mean, it's in reference to resources or somebody being unpleasant, and so on. And when we do that, we find a series of constructions, different constructions, which, I mean, none of these will be surprising. Means that is by far the most common, so something means that something else. And these 8 constructions account for over 90% of the actual use of means and meaning in the COCA database, the American Contemporary American English database. So what I'm going to do is have a quick look at the top 3 and present an idea about what means, the word means, is doing in these contexts. And then I'll suggest, I won't be able to demonstrate because that would take us all night as well, that the same basic idea applies to all the other constructions as well. So let's have a quick look at the means that construction. A fault in the drying cycle means that the machine overheats. And as an hour-a-week meeting means that there's not adequate communication, and Jesus' resurrection means that we will not die, not in the eternal sense. I'll come back to that, but have a look at the means and the participle one first. A cure means giving up drugs. Horses need ample fresh water, which means keeping water troughs clean and filled, and to see things differently means changing ourselves in some way. And then means plus a comparative quantity adjective. Tourism is still down. That means fewer jobs, lower wages. Being a breastfeeding mother also means less ovarian cancer, and scarce ice means fewer perches from which polar bears can search for seals. Okay, what I think emerges from a consideration of these examples is that what means is doing here is kind of signaling an inference. It's an inference marker, if you like. We have a fault in the drying cycle, therefore the machine will overheat. Whoops. Jesus has been resurrected, therefore we will not die, not in the eternal sense. Means that is being used as an inference marker. Given this, we can infer that. Given that we only have an hour-a-week meeting, we can infer that that won't amount to adequate communication. Similarly here, horses need ample fresh water. We can infer from that that we need to keep the water troughs clean and filled. If you want to see things differently, you can infer from that you need to change yourself in some particular way. If you want a cure, we can infer that you'll have to give up drugs. And the same with this. Tourism still down. We can infer that that's going to lead to fewer jobs and lower wages, and so on. So in all three constructions, means, the word means, whether it's in whichever one of the three versions it's used, is being used as an inference marker. It's almost the equivalent of therefore or consequently. Syntactically, it's not the equivalent, but in terms of the job it's doing, the function, its functional role, that's basically what it's the equivalent of. And that means that these three constructions are kind of interchangeable. To see things differently means changing ourselves in some way, or you could put that differently and say to see things differently means that we have to change ourselves in some way. Similarly with tourism, tourism is still down, that means fewer jobs. Tourism is still down, which means that there will be fewer jobs and lower wages. So these constructions are basically interchangeable, and in each case, means is basically an inference marker. Just to kind of dramatize that bit, I've changed some of the examples again into a more explicit inference marker like therefore, seeing differently, therefore changing ourselves in some way. Tourism is still down, therefore fewer jobs and low wages. Jesus' resurrection, Jesus has been resurrected, therefore we will not die, not in the eternal sense. In all these cases, what we have then is an inference, very often practical, like for example needing to keep the water troughs clean and full, but sometimes just to cause an effect like the machine overheating. In all cases, I think there's presupposed a background theory, usually causal or quasi-causal. For example, in the Jesus case, there's a kind of theological theory about the consequences, quasi-causal consequences, a series of mechanisms which leads from the resurrection to eternal life. In the other examples, it's perhaps more obviously causal. I mean, horses need, for physiological reasons, biological reasons, need lots of clean, fresh water. Therefore, we need to keep the troughs full. And of course, the belief may not be shared by others. The most obvious case of that is probably the Jesus example, because it's not everybody who believes that you can infer from the resurrection to eternal life. So anybody who is using the word means in these contexts is making an inference based on a background theory or belief, very often a causal one or a quasi-causal one, and it's a belief that may or may not be shared by the audience. So it's the speaker's theory, the speaker's belief, and the inference which the speaker draws on the basis of that belief, and it may well be that the belief isn't actually shared by the audience that he or she is addressing. Okay, so that's an account of what means as a word does in the top three constructions that I've listed again here. What I would want to say, and again we can spend all evening on this, is that the function of means in each of the other constructions and meaning for the bottom two is exactly the same, or very roughly exactly the same, if that's not an oxymoron, very close to being identical. In all cases, mean or meaning or means is basically an inference marker, an inference based on a background theory with some kind of implication, and a theory, of course, that's not necessarily shared by everybody that you're addressing. Just very quickly, an example of that, meaning of a general concept, meaning of marriage. There's some examples from Coker, fairly topical ones. Been a lot of statements like this of late. The meaning of marriage is the union of a man and a woman. The unitive meaning of marriage cannot be separated from the procreative, and so on. So what we have here is there's clearly a background theory somewhere. In some cases it may be religious, in other cases it may be purely lexicographical. To create a gay marriage is to change the meaning of marriage. That could just be based on some kind of lexicographical theory about meanings and why and how they're not changed or they are changed. And then there's an inference, or in these cases implied, and it's obviously a kind of practical inference, which is to create a gay marriage is to change the meaning of marriage, and so somewhere there's an implied inference, so don't do it, or it shouldn't be legalized, or it shouldn't be accepted socially, or so on. In the wider context from which these sentences come from, that's always spelled out, that particular practical inference is spelled out. You shouldn't be doing this. Excuse me. So basically this takes the same form. Background theory, an inference based on that, and the background theory is not necessarily one shared by the audience who you are addressing. And of course, if the audience doesn't share the background theory, then they may not well share the inference either. To summarize, and here's my kind of quasi-famous ancestor again, means and meaning are inference markers based on background beliefs, often involving causal or quasi-causal theories. The background belief is one that others may or may not share, and the inference may and often is practical. In other words, it implies something that you should be doing or you shouldn't be doing, like engaging in a gay marriage. But it can also be causal, like again the overheating machine. So does this actually have any methodological implications? My claim, just to summarize, is that the analysis I've just summarized applies to the vast majority of all uses of the cognates of the word mean. Mean means meaning. And that we should be bearing this in mind if we propose to do some kind of research on meaning, as the kind where meaning is incorporated in a statement of research aims, for example. So what kind of methodological implications are there? One of them is, if this account is correct, let's suspend disbelief for a minute and imagine that it is, and everything I've said about meaning is generalizable to all the other constructions I haven't talked about, then clearly there can be no such thing as the meaning, because meaning is an inference based on a theory held by the individual speaker or writer, and may not be shared by anybody else. So the idea somehow that there is such a thing as the meaning of anything is probably not going to be right. The source of meaning. We tend to think informally of meaning as somehow an attribute possessed by whatever it is said to mean or to have meaning. But on the analysis I've just offered, that's not right, because it's actually a way of referring to an inference made by somebody. It's an inference marker. If the speaker says X means that something, or the meaning of X is, she's not saying that X possesses anything. She's saying that she has a theory, and that this theory warrants, at least for her, a certain inference. So the source of the meaning isn't the X, but the speaker. In some ways, I suppose this is obvious. If, for example, a famous example from a philosopher called Paul Grice, clouds mean rain. The meaning rain is not an additional attribute of the cloud. I mean, the cloud has various biological, various chemical properties, but meaning rain is not an additional property on top of any of those. So the idea that the clouds mean rain is clearly an inference of the fact that having seen clouds, we can infer that rain is likely. So the source of meaning in that case, and I'm arguing in all the others, is actually the speaker or the writer. Okay, so if a researcher seeks to elucidate the meaning of something in a research project, qualitative research project, the first thing I think we need to get clear about is exactly whose inference warranting theory are we talking about? Because there are two people, well, more than two, because there are more than one participant, but let's separate the roles out. There are two roles to whom this could actually apply. We could be talking about the participant's theory and the inferences that he or she bases on that theory, or we could be talking about the researcher's theory and the inference that the researcher can base on the theory. And it's interesting how many researchers and methodologists actually fudge this point and leave it kind of ambiguous. Van Manen is a case in point, Smith, Flowers and Larkin are a case in point. Throughout that book, Smith, Flowers and Larkin, Interpretive Phenomenological Analysis, there's a kind of hedging between the participant's meaning or the participant's interpretation, the researcher's meaning or the researcher's interpretation of whatever it is, and then a kind of hybrid thing in which you're talking about the researcher's interpretation of the participant's interpretation of what's happened to them. And of course, given this particular genre of research discourse, you very quickly get to talking about a reader's interpretation of the researcher's interpretation of the participant's interpretation of what's actually happened to them, and that gets to be at the very least convoluted, and from my point of view I can't see that it's particularly interesting or helpful. So this thing is actually fudged a lot, and one of the ways in which it's fudged for researchers and methodologists alike, but particularly researchers, is to actually talk about the meaning, the thing that I've said is illegitimate. So my research aim is to elucidate the meaning of something, and that's effectively an invitation, or it's endorsing the fact that I can not distinguish or fail to distinguish between the participant's theory and inferences and the researcher's theories and inferences, and then things get very fudgy and very messy. So that's the first thing that we need to decide. I mean, we also need to decide obviously exactly what is it that we want to know about these theories and inferences, and that needs a lot of hard thinking as well. I mean, classically, I think in the form of a question or a list of questions about what questions do I actually want to get answered about people's, not so much meanings because that's not helpful, but people's theories and inferences. Okay, so we have two options, and then I'm quickly to look at, and then I'm done. If we're interested in the participant's theory, as opposed to the researcher's one, so the researcher is reporting on the participant's background theory and inferences, then I think we need a wider range of methods to identify the participant's background theory, because I don't think traditional open-ended questions are anywhere near enough. For one thing, I mean, there's two reasons for that. Firstly, if you ask open-ended questions, or questions that are too open-ended, you're basically giving the participant a blank check to talk about pretty much anything, and that might mean that they don't actually talk about what you want them to talk about. And in the second place, and in some ways more interestingly, more importantly, people don't have, I mean, all the evidence suggests, a transparent access to their own beliefs, what philosophers call propositional attitudes, and especially those beliefs that precipitate action. If we're interested in beliefs and meanings because we think that affects how people act, then those kind of meanings, those kind of beliefs, those kind of theories are not necessarily accessible, consciously accessible to the people concerned. So we need to borrow methods from psychology, various forms of psychology, in order to identify those beliefs and theories and attitudes of which the participant may actually be unaware. So that's the participant theory, if we're interested in that, but suppose we're interested in the researcher's theory, we're not that bothered about the participants, in which case I think we need a wider range of theories borrowed from psychology and sociology that we use to explain the data. And these theories should be explicit, expressly borrowed from the disciplines concerned, and used to model or explain the data that we've got. And the data that I'm referring to here are the interview responses of the participants. In this sense, to use an old ethnomethodological expression, the interview transcript is a topic it's there to be analysed. It's not a resource. The participants are not giving you a helping hand. They're just basically generating data. And in this version of the two options, I'm suggesting that we actually import models from psychology and sociology in order to model that data effectively. IPA gets, I think, closest to this of the methodologists in qualitative studies and the ones that talk about meaning that I've come across. Although I think Smith, Flowers and Larkin restrict themselves to a fairly limited range of theories that they actually borrow. They claim in some parts of the book actually not to import theories from outside at all, but all too clearly they do. And one in particular is something that they do routinely, which are things to do with identity. And most of the stuff I think of theirs that I've looked at, the key issue is where they can find issues to do with identity in what the participant is saying. So I think that's fine as far as it goes, but I think we need a much wider range of stuff that we can borrow and use to actually model and explain the data that we have in front of us. Okay, I'm done. That's it. I think I've more or less stuck to the agreed time limit, and I would be more than happy to take any questions that anybody may have. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, John. So everyone, please feel free to ask your questions or say anything you would like to say as a comment. I have one person. I see one person who raised her hand. Well, let me see. It looks like she or he lowered her hand, and it's not up to her. And I do not see anyone having written any questions here. Faith, she said now, interesting, thanks. Okay, Faith, would you like to add anything to this? Would you like me to give you the microphone? Faith, let me see here. Okay, Laura, I'm going to give you the microphone, Laura. It's always good to hear voices, so participants, I mean. So Laura, Marcos, the microphone is yours. Laura? Okay, maybe she's not. She does not have a working microphone, so I will read her question. Okay.
Okay. Yep.
Let me mute you now, and the question is the following: in the absence of existing literature on how to make meaning as a researcher, what are your ideas on how to do this work?
Well, I mean, I think I was trying to give a quick indication of that towards the end. I think in this context, the word meaning itself, and as I say, its cognates, mean and means, is not terribly helpful. And I think actually it's more, I go beyond that and say it's actually counterproductive, because I think it encourages a certain laziness about how we think about what a research project looks like. If you think, for example, that there's basically a research template in which all you have to do is identify, I don't know, a phenomenon or a kind of experience and say, right, I am going to explore the meaning of whatever phenomenon it is from the point of view of a particular group of people, then that's kind of a sort of a pro forma. It's a sort of research pro forma. You can just kind of fill in the gaps, the group of people concerned and the phenomenon concerned, and hey presto, you've got yourself a research project. And unfortunately, with that pro forma, there goes a whole series of procedures that you adopt at that point, which is you interview a number of people from that group, usually not very many, and you record what they say, and then you do a fairly standard kind of qualitative analysis on that data. Although you may, of course, adopt something like Giorgi's method or Van Maanen's method or Colantz's method or whatever it is, and do something with, in terms of, for example, in the Giorgi case, of dividing the text into meaning units and doing transformation and so on. Or you may at least persuade yourself that that's what you're doing, because as I was hoping to suggest earlier on, in fact, I don't think there's actually a method there at all. I mean, you might as well just make stuff up. So I don't think, actually, in the end, that meaning is a helpful concept, and I think is actually counterproductive, because it actually takes people in a direction which I don't think is useful. So I would prefer to talk about people's theories, the things I was calling background theories, their theories about certain things and the inferences that they base on those theories. And instead of talking about meaning, we should be asking about what people's theories of something are, and the inferences that they base on those theories. So if they've had a certain kind of experience and encounter with a certain phenomenon, there will be theories that they have about that, both theories that they may be aware of and theories that they may be not aware of, and they will be basing certain inferences about, for example, what they do next on those theories. Those are the things that we can find out about, and I don't think talking about meaning is actually terribly helpful in that context.
Thank you, John. There is a question by Cassandra, and Cassandra, I will give you the microphone. Go ahead. All right. So she may not have a microphone. So I will read her question out loud.
Okay.
That's the following: can you expound more on IPA and how this is useful in conducting a phenomenological study?
I mean, I have a couple of problems with IPA, probably more than two, but a couple that occur to me. One is that it comes in a very muddy philosophical package. I mean, there's a couple of chapters at the beginning of that book which go into phenomenology, hermeneutics, from various sources, Husserl, Heidegger, Gadamer, I think, is in there. They are, on my reading, they're very... well, they're bordering on contradictory. I mean, not as contradictory as Van Manen tends to be, but there's a lot of stuff that doesn't actually kind of cohere right, doesn't actually make sense. And I think if you just kind of blow all that away, you know, it's just froth. Just blow the philosophical froth away, and let's get down to cases. Then what you have is, okay, we actually want to question, we want to actually identify something that we don't know and would like to know, something we want to find out about. So that's the first job, and that's the first job that anybody in the research business should be kind of accepting, agreeing with. And then, okay, we conduct interviews. And subsequently analyze those. With IPA, the sense is, for me, the stuff that I've read, is that they're always looking for this identity stuff. In fact, if you read some of their interview transcripts, you get the impression, sometimes, not all the time, but you get the impression that the interview is actually coaching the respondent in order to produce something which is close to what the interviewer is looking for. It's got something to do with identity, something to do with loss, something ideally to do with loss of identity. And when the interviewer actually mentions anything like that, when the respondent mentions anything like that, the interviewer frequently effectively congratulates them in a way that sort of reinforces that and says, let's have more of that, please. And so they're constantly looking for this identity stuff. Now, to a degree, that's okay. I wish they were more explicit about it, about what they were doing. But I think, as I said towards the end of the actual talk, that it's very limited, it's very narrow. There are lots more interesting things that we could be talking about, models, theories that we borrow from adjacent disciplines and from healthcare disciplines that we could be using to explain and account for and model the data that we've actually got as a result of an interview, and where we're not actually coaching the interviewee about what we actually want to hear about. So yes, IPA is kind of a model, partial model for the kind of thing I'm talking about, but I think it's a very restricted model, and I think it needs to be expanded. I think the philosophical stuff needs to be blown away, and I think we need to be a bit more hard-nosed about what we're actually doing and where the theories that we're using are actually coming from.
Thank you, John. I have two questions, one from Martha and one from Olga. And I will try to give the microphone to Martha.
Okay.
Are you there, Martha? Do you have a working microphone? Do you? Well, looks like you're not lucky today. But so I'm going to mute you, and I'm going to read your question, Martha. And she asked the following. This has been very well. Let me see. Let me start. Thank you, Dr. Paley. This has been very helpful. My question is, would this approach be more congruent with phenomenology than with any other research design?
I think no. I mean, it would be my answer to that. Phenomenology or various genres in phenomenology are the ones that have actually dealt in the currency of meaning, and I think they've made a very bad job of it overall. IPA is a kind of partial exception. So for me, that whole package, phenomenology and meaning, and I mean, actually the idea of a phenomenon, the idea of an experience, none of these terms ever get any kind of detailed discussion. They're just taken on trust. Meaning's taken on trust. Experience is taken on trust. Everybody knows what experience is. Actually, no, we don't. Everybody knows what a phenomenon is. Well, no. How do you pick out a phenomenon? Where does one phenomenon end and another start? I mean, there are all these questions that you would expect to have been discussed, and they're not. So the whole package for me is actually a bit of a mess. It's semantically a mess. It's theoretically a mess. Philosophically, it's certainly a mess. And if anybody wanted to pursue the kind of ideas I was presenting in the second half of my talk, I would say let's forget about phenomenology altogether, tear that up and start again, and start from the kind of basis that I was indicating a few minutes ago. What is it we want to know the answer to? What questions do we want to know the answer to? Are we more interested in the participants' theories about and inferences, or are we actually not so much interested in that, and we want to actually use our own to understand what's going on and understand the participants' account of what goes on? So those are the two basic first questions. What do I want to know, and whose theories crudely am I talking about, mine or the participants? If you're going to fudge that, which phenomenologists characteristically do, then I think you're just kind of heading back into the mess of the package. Personally, I would just say, can we just forget about phenomenology, the philosophy, the so-called method, the meaning, the experience, the phenomenon, all of that, and just actually start again?
Okay, thank you, John. I have 3 more questions. First, Olga, and let's see if we are lucky this time. Olga, please use the microphone. Let's see if you can. If you have a, yes, you do. It looks like.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can. Hello, Olga.
Oh, hi, John. Hi. It's great. My microphone works.
Yes,
so, yes. Great to hear you again, John. And I am excited that although you retired, you are still active.
So, don't get rid of me that easily.
Yeah. So I am going just to read whatever I wrote here. I said, as you know, I am a big fan of your scholarship. So my.
Oh, that's Olga. Hi, Olga.
Hi. You have pointed out again strong similarities between Amedeo Giorgi's and Max van Manen's approaches. I would like to ask you whether you see some significant differences also in how in type of research they do, and what are those differences?
Yeah, there are some. I mean, I think that I'm getting a lot of echo. I'm hearing myself 2 seconds later. Oh, right, thank you. Okay, that's better. Yeah, I mean, I obviously, for the purposes of this talk, I was more interested in the similarities, and I kind of skated around the differences. You're right, there are differences, fairly clear differences. I mean, Giorgi takes himself to be a kind of down the middle of the line Husserlian, rightly or wrongly. Van Manen is more of a kind of mixture. He owes allegiance both to the kind of Husserlian side of the divide and the more Heideggerian side. I mean, not those directly, but I mean that's basically what it amounts to. And as a result, on my reading, Giorgi is at least kind of consistent about his philosophical background. I mean, I don't know how persuasive it is, but at least it's fairly consistent. For me, Van Manen isn't. I mean, for example, Van Manen talks about, on one page, Van Manen says something like, well, we're interested in experience, and that's pre-linguistic, pre-conceptual, pre-verbal. And then 2 pages later, he's talking about experience being soaked through with language. Now, I don't personally see how you can have it both ways. I mean, it may well be there is some way of reconciling those 2 things, to say both that experience is pre-verbal and that it's soaked in language. But I don't understand how he does that, and he never explains how those 2 actually are consistent. So I think the philosophical background in the 2 cases is very different. But I also think more closely related to what I've been talking about, that the methodological approach is different as well. I mean, I think they share the same thing, which at the end of the day, what they both do in terms of meaning transformations and so on. I mean, Van Manen doesn't call them that, is fairly arbitrary. The difference is that Van Manen, and I did mention this in passing, has an agenda. At least for me, he has an agenda. And that's to do with, he clearly has some very clear ideas about parenthood and pedagogy, as he calls it. And in his analyses, and again he has examples in the book in researching lived experience, and they're worth looking at. There's an example on the phenomenon of feeling left or being left or abandoned, and there are 12 cases that he analyzes of that phenomenon. Use his own term. So that's one example, and then there's another example in which he presents a story by somebody called Robert's mother, talking about her relationship with her son, and then he gives an analysis, a phenomenological analysis of that, when he's discussed it. And in that particular case, that was the example I was actually going to give before I realized I didn't really have the time. What's amazing is, again, and again, you need to check relevant chapter in the book to see how this works for you. But for me, I read Robert's mother's story, and Van Manen picks out a single word from that story, the word hope. And it's mentioned in passing. It's not particularly significant on my reading in the story, but Van Manen picks that one word out and amplifies it massively. His analysis of Robert's mother's story is about twice as long as Robert's mother's own account, and it's just dominated by hope. Hope appears on every line, and it's almost, read it, people, it's almost a paean to hope. It's like a Pauline epistle on hope, faith, hope, and charity. Well, this is Van Manen's epistle on hope, and you look at that, and you look at what he started with, Robert's mother's story, and you think, how the hell did he get from there to there? It's simply, you don't know. There's just no way of telling, and there's nothing in the text that explains how this is supposed to be analysis of that. So in that sense, like Giorgi's analyses, it's arbitrary, but much, much more so than Giorgi, it has this sense of an agenda. He knows what he wants to say, and he uses his data. I think with Van Manen, a lot of the time he's using his data as a peg on which to hang his own particular obsessions. So that would be a particularly important difference as well.
We have two more. Constantina, she is from Surrey, and I'm going to give you the microphone, Constantina. Let me see. Go ahead. Do you have a working microphone?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can, Constantina. Hello. Good evening.
Hi there. Good evening. Thank you so much for this very, very interesting presentation. I did my PhD and I used IPA to find out meaning-making processes of patients and caregivers. What I would like to ask here, though, is something slightly different. I would like to hear your views on exploring meaning in people's inferences in using quantitative methods. And do you really think whether is meaning quantifiable?
Oh God, yes, of course. I mean, the idea that it. Sorry, I interrupted you. Finish.
No.
Sorry, you finished? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Yeah. Okay. So, sorry about that. Yes, I do think it's quantifiable. I think most things are. I think the insistence or the assumption, actually, not so much the insistence, the assumption that it isn't is a prejudice that goes back 40, 50 years, or even further back to the beginnings of the whole qualitative research movement. And this is not, incidentally, a kind of plea for more quantitative research rather than qualitative. That's not what I mean at all. I don't think the distinction between qualitative and quantitative methods is particularly interesting. It certainly doesn't have for me any philosophical significance. I mean, the difference between qualitative methods and quantitative methods is a bit like the difference between, I don't know, a carpenter's saw and a carpenter's hammer. Two different tools to do two different jobs. You use a saw to, saw a plank in half. You use a hammer to knock a nail into the wall. You don't get any carpenters who say, well, as a matter of principle, I only ever use saws for anything, and you don't get other carpenters who say, positivist carpenters who say, as a matter of principle, I only ever use hammers. It's just not like that. And I don't think research should be like that either. Qualitative and quantitative methods, different kinds of tools for different kind of jobs. So it depends what you mean by the quantification of meaning. I don't think in principle that there's any objection to that, but it would have to depend very much on the nature of the question that you are asking. For example, if you were interested in people's beliefs about something, you could adopt an approach which you might regard as quantitative, but given that there are lots of accounts around about the epidemiology of belief, how beliefs are distributed within a particular population, the way of getting at that would have to be quantitative, because you'd have to have a proper sample and you'd have to do statistical work with it and so on. But you would be talking about beliefs and people's theories and the inferences. You could do that. So in my terms, you're talking about something that I would use, terminology that I would use, instead of the meaning terminology. So to that degree, yes, you'll be using quantitative methods in the context of meaning. I don't see any problem with that. And I don't know, it'd be interesting to hear if anybody thinks there is some particular theoretical, philosophical or practical reason why there is a problem with that.
Thank you, John. We're coming to the end of the presentation. A comment written by Faith. And Faith wrote the following, thanks again, just a comment. I think the distinction between participant versus researcher theories is relevant and interesting to consider for quantitative analysis as well. So she followed up from what you just said.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Faith, for that comment. I want to say just one thing, a few questions from people asking about whether or not this presentation will be available. Greg, for example. And yes, this will be available. Is that correct, John? Can you give the presentation to Yvette so she can post it on?
I'm happy to send the PPT file to Yvette. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, John, and thank you, John, for being part of this webinar series, and thank you all of you for having joined us. I will give the microphone to Yvette so that Yvette can say some final words. Yvette?
Thanks, Ricardo. Thank you, John. That was great. I just want to let everyone know that we do still have our abstract submissions are open for our Qualitative Methods Conference next year in Melbourne, Australia. You can go to www.iiqm.ualberta.ca for more information and to submit your abstracts.
Thank you very much, Yvette, and thank you all of you for joining us, as I said. And I just want to reemphasize, and I've done this in other sessions, is your support is very, very important for this series. We want to reach out to people from all countries, from everywhere. Whoever is interested in methodology and qualitative methods, or methodology in particular, are all welcome. So thank you, all of you. Thank you, John, again. John, any final words?
No, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, and thanks to everybody who attended.
Thank you, John. You will be receiving, everyone, an email, an automated email that will have a link to the website from where you will be able to download both the recording of this session as well as the PowerPoint. But for the recording, please wait a few hours. Thank you, all of you. Goodbye.